Hallo, Republika.
Hi, Republica.
Ja, mein Name ist Alice Hasters.
My name is Alice Hasters.
Podcasterin.
I'm a podcaster and author,
Gesagt hat.
as Niels so kindly said.
Ich wurde gefragt, ob ich dieses Jahr auf der
And I was asked if I might like to give a session at Republica, and I was very happy and said yes.
Mir denn einfallen zu dem
What could I talk about that fits with this year's motto, any way the wind blows? Which way is the wind blowing? My first association was towards change or evolution and towards exhaustion,
Denn Veränderung wird kommen.
because change is coming.
Drastischen Wandel.
We are facing drastic evolution. And what's drastic evolution if you look at it positively? A revolution.
Allerdings das Problem,
The problem here, though, is that revolution sounds really exhausting, and many of us, especially after 2 years of a pandemic, are extremely exhausted.
den Anschein machen, dass diese
It
beiden
might look like these two things, change or evolution and exhaustion, are opposites, that evolution would be so tiring, so exhausting that it would end in exhaustion and standstill. But that's because we still think that we can stop change through our actions. That's not the case. We can only shape the change.
schon wieder extrem anstrengend.
Yeah, I notice it myself. It sounds very tiring, changing our lives, changing the world, changing society, help. But I don't think it's the large-scale changes that are exhausting us. I think the exhaustion comes from the fact that we are trying to stop inevitable change and clinging to a way of life that even today only works for a fair few and that's no longer going to be sustainable in future. What leads me to these thoughts? Well, I've been very tired for a while, and that stresses me out, and that exhausts me even more. My alarm clock and I have been in a toxic relationship for months now. I always pledge to respect it more every night, and when it sounds in dulcet tones in the morning, I pretend not to know it and sleep with my guilty conscience instead. Exhaustion isn't really something new for me. I've always worked a lot. I had to as an ambitious person with not a lot of money, but ironically enough, these days with financial security and job offers that I didn't even dare dream about, I noticed that I've run out of energy. At a point in time where everything should be easier, I really, really struggle to make decisions, to go shopping, to call people. Every day, the simplest tasks defeat me, and not a day goes by where I don't ignore a call or fail to reply to an email. The chance of making this talk was about 50%. I slept 4 hours today and only started writing this yesterday. But in order to get out of this state, I tried a lot of things. I tried self-care. I tried to sleep more, eat well, look after my health, optimize my to-do lists. But all of that didn't help a lot. It felt as though my psyche was on strike. It said, enough is enough. You're going to lie down. I'm going to throw out your sense of time and your ability to concentrate. And because you wouldn't get it otherwise, I'm also going to barricade your general enjoyment of life. You're going to be sitting here until you understand that it cannot go on like this. And my psyche incited a revolution without notifying me brutally, consequentially, and radically. A revolution that's born from an exhaustion that forces me to change something. Some people might call it burnout, but I've never been officially diagnosed with that. It's purely conjecture, and as you all can see, I'm standing here and I'm talking, so I'm still working. And the ideas that I'm going to speak about are more theoretical than practical for me. I haven't really accepted my psyche's request for change, and the process is still underway. And what I'm going to present you in this state is an idea. It's up to you to decide if it's useful. I would also want to avoid the misunderstanding that I might be an advocate of exhaustion. I don't want to ask you to work to exhaustion to unlock the true revolutionary inner potential that you have. I don't want to brag about my exhaustion or fall into this weird narrative that burnout has to be part of a good career story. I don't want to ask, if you don't have burnout, did you actually work? Did you actually live? This service-mindedness is so deeply ingrained in us that we think that we have to earn our own burnout. We also often think that we have to exploit this exhaustion, because a good career story often goes like this: I worked so much, then I got burnout, I noticed I had to change, and now I've got a great new business idea, my life is so much better, my product is without microplastics, vegan, join the community. For a better life, buy this. You're Finn Kliman.
Spaß. Es geht nicht darum,
It's not about making something of your own exhaustion. It's more about interpreting exhaustion. What does it mean? That's what interests me. I believe that exhaustion really needs change. And this is a state that prevents us from ignoring the fact that we can't carry on like this. I want to invite those of you who are exhausted or who feel exhausted, maybe not quite as drastically as me, to give space to this feeling, this idea that it's not change, but the refusal to change comes from my personal lived experience, but I can also give personal reasons. So here are some reasons or some arguments for why it's the status quo that makes us exhausted.
Number one, the fact that supports this thesis the most is probably the climate crisis. The fact is we consume too much. And by we, I mean countries in the global north or the Western countries. There's simply not enough resources to continue living the way we do. There's not enough water to keep producing all the clothes and meat. There's not enough sand to build all the buildings we want, and not enough forest to reabsorb all the CO2 pumped into the air. The earth is exhausted. And how are we going to make a revolution if we continue to gut our earth like this? So the planet and I are going through the same thing, so to speak. It's what I'm trying to argue about. Hear me out. The earth and people are not separate entities. We cannot exploit the earth without exploiting ourselves. This is a principle that is always found in the resistance movements of Black and Indigenous groups. By Indigenous groups, I mean the indigenous people of the Americas, Australia, Oceania, and the Arctic. I will simply call them indigenous people, even if it doesn't really apply from a European perspective. So I'm aware of that, but just asked to accept it for this lecture. White people in Western countries come from a tradition that experienced the exploitation of the earth as an enhancement of their own quality of life, whereas most Black and Indigenous people are descendants of those who experienced a drastic decline in quality of life through that exploitation. This is so drastic that I find it cynical to even use the word quality of life here. Enslavement and extermination have nothing to do with life, but only with survival. It was black and indigenous people who were considered primitive people. And with this attribution, they were made as subjects of Christian people. That means the people were treated like nature itself, as a commodity, as a resource, or an infestation that had to be destroyed to make way for civilized societies. These so-called primitive peoples were constructed as the opposite of so-called European civilized peoples, meaning those who were attributed civilization and culture. The result was that we separated two things: culture and civilization on the one hand, and nature and primitivity on the other hand. Progress and development thus demanded a demarcation from nature. This also meant a demarcation from blackness or from indigeneity, something that we have not completely got over to this day. You can still feel it in our language today. For example, the words art and artificial are from the same vocabulary. And art is the opposite of nature. I think that by now we should have realized that the dichotomy of nature and culture was in many ways a mistake, not to say a lie. But we stick through with this attitude for a very long time, and now we're stuck with a lifestyle that ignores natural cycles and depends on certain parts of the world's population not adopting this way of life, because otherwise resources that are essential for survival would be completely used up tomorrow. But the great thing is that we continue to sell this lifestyle to people in other countries as a life goal. We call this the fight against poverty or development cooperation. Boost your economy, but protect nature. Don't cut down the rainforest, please, but would you have more land to grow animal feed? That's that the demarcation between nature and culture was a mistake becomes very clear when you draw the global context like a woodcut. But of course, the negative consequences also affect people here. It also affects us, because as it turns out, a demarcation from nature is bad for your health, mentally as well as physically. And now we sit in cities, we're stressed, we long for nature, which seems inaccessible to many people, making them prefer to watch a video of a forest in the sunshine on their meditation app and listening to bird songs from their loudspeakers instead of going to a forest, because they don't have time for that. So it's clinging to this false narrative, to this false self-image that makes us tired. Culture and nature should have never been mutually exclusive. What is not compatible, however, is nature and modern capitalism. We must not forget that colonialism, the whole drawing borders between countries and between people, was about one thing above all: capital. And this takes us to argument number 2. Capitalism makes you tired. Yes, it turns out this is a critique of capitalism. Criticism of capitalism makes many people nervous because capitalism is often equated with democracy. Those who criticize capitalism also criticize democracy and are against participation and self-determination. I would say the opposite is the case. These are values that I consider very important and that I would not want to do without or deny others. And this is precisely why I criticize the system, because it makes participation and self-determination impossible for many people. Fans of capitalism like to emphasize the innovation that the system brings. And there's no doubt that human beings have never been as inventive as in capitalism. Capitalist societies have invented a lot of impressive things that have simplified a lot of things for us. Thank you for that. But as I said, we are at a stage where we invent apps to see a forest, I think the time has come to ask ourselves whether innovation also means consistent social progress. One thing fans of capitalism like to emphasize is freedom. It's the system that has inscribed freedom as a central value: freedom of expression, freedom of art, economic freedom. You're allowed to do what you want. But there's a little catch. You're allowed to do what you want as long as you have enough money to support your lifestyle. And that excludes some people again. Capitalism is a pyramid scheme. It's not meant for everyone to be on top, where the breeze of freedom is especially fresh. It was only intended for a few from the beginning. But hey, we accept that because we could all belong to it, to the happy group of the free, if we're just really ambitious and hardworking and smart and follow the rules, but also take a little risk and be unique, but also conform. Or just inherit. That works too, of course. To be honest, rich people don't really seem free to me either. Living in gated communities, behind bars, and out of touch with the majority of the population, that doesn't really feel like freedom to me. But out of this innovation and desire for freedom, the following paradox has arisen. Our system insists that a security must be obtained through wage labor, and at the same time, we invent things that replace people as labor. That would mean we could work much less, but we don't do that because we need money. And that means that there are more and more so-called bullshit jobs, jobs that actually are necessary, but are there to ensure participation in the capitalist system. According to David Graeber, who invented the bullshit job theory, office workers, administrators, consultants, telemarketers, service staff, and many others are affected by this. Work devoid of meaning can make people ill. It can lead to exhaustion. The number of people with burnouts and depression is rising, as is the number of bullshit jobs. That's a correlation, first of all, and not a causality. But let's put it this way, for me, a connection seems obvious. Capitalism, as we have built it, cannot do without exploitation. And the exploited are obviously not free. This has been especially obvious in the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. Those called systemic were mostly people with long hours and little pay, largely women, and many of them were migrants. Those who care, clean, build, harvest, slaughter. The double burden of having to care for children and family members in need while continuing to work remotely hit a higher proportion of women and poor people much harder. So this takes us to argument number 3. It's a rich man's world. During the pandemic, it became clear that this system, what the system can do without and who is dispensable. Those who were no longer supposed to work were thrown into crisis, while the others came to feel that the system, and this mainly concerned care work, whether paid or unpaid, that they desperately need but do not respect. This affected and still affects women to a disproportionate extent, and this circumstance has also been justified for many, many years with a social view that is just in the nature of women or those who are read as such to do care work. And as such, there can be no exploitation of these people because this work is done out of love, isn't it? And it's rewarding in itself. Women also like to be placed in the direction of nature. The value of women is generated through the body and the value of men through the spirit. A large part of women's value is defined by natural cycles, fertility, and reproductive functions, something we should attribute to nature. And nature is open to exploitation, as we all know. So those are racist, patriarchal narratives that oppose nature and naturalness and maintain the class system in capitalism. Quite honestly, that sounds exhausting. And I think it's time to let go. To change something about these circumstances doesn't necessarily mean mobilizing forces from the last corner of one's mind, but can also mean consistently giving into exhaustion. Exhaustion is a huge motive in some of the greatest revolutions of our time, such as the Fridays for Future movement, who was exhausted of going to school with an uncertain future. At Black Lives Matter protests, a state of exhaustion was described over and over again. I can't breathe. And the Me Too movement was exhausted of perpetrators being protected. Pursuing exhaustion and giving into exhaustion is a step into the unknown. It is scary and risky. Paradoxically, most of all for those who had the greatest right to exhaustion. Being exhausted may seem selfish, and I don't think it is. It's a way to call for solidarity and a sense of community. Even if I'm not the best example, even if I don't practice what I preach, I want to offer you this thought. And even though it's a bit lame, I use a sentence here that I've written before, but that I find quite appropriate in this context. What it takes is courage. Courage to be vulnerable and to trust others to be as uncomfortable as ye are. Thank you very much.